Friends, I welcome you all for my talk on the phenomenology of consciousness, East-West perspectives. What I am going to do in this presentation is to show how phenomenology, one of the important moments of the 20th century, has been playing a very important role in Western philosophical discourse. Also, I would like to show whether there could be any parallel in Indian philosophical tradition. So when I say it is East-West perspective, I am going to take up Indian philosophical discourse from the Eastern perspective. Of course, West we will discuss Husserl. Now, there are three important turns in philosophy. These three turns are very important in the 20th century. The first one is the linguistic turn. Wittgenstein is mainly responsible for this turn, the linguistic turn, or we can call it as analytic turn also. Then the hermeneutic turn, and Heidegger and Gadamer are mainly responsible for this. And then third one is the cognitive turn, wherein one can place thinkers like Jerry Fodor, Churchland, Dennett, and many others. Now, what is interesting is that all these three movements are interrelated. That is the uniqueness of these three turns. All the three turns, namely linguistic, hermeneutic, as well as cognitive turn, are interrelated. But we will be mainly concentrating on the cognitive turn, that is the third turn, where we are going to discuss the relation that exists between the knower and known. That is, a person is to know that he has a knowledge of this or that, provided there exists the object outside him, and there should also be a knower. That is, in order to say that there is a podium in front of me, I should see the object, namely the podium, and also I must exist, I as the knower and the podium as the object. Then only I can claim that I have the knowledge of this podium. And there are different ways of understanding knowledge. We call it the source of knowledge. How do we gain knowledge? There are various ways by which one can gain knowledge. And the validity of knowledge. The knowledge has to be supported by others, in the sense that if I make a claim, then it should be endorsed or supported by others, so that my knowledge is a valid one. For example, if we say a missing child was taken away by a dragon, nobody would believe that. So you can question my statement, the validity of the statement. So the validity of the statement has to be approved or supported by others. In this context, we have to see, that is in phenomenology, we will see, is mind different from consciousness? This is one of the important issues that is discussed, especially in the Eastern philosophy or Indian philosophy, and they have made a distinction between the mind and consciousness, and why philosophers are interested in the notion of consciousness. What makes a philosopher to involve himself or herself in the concept of consciousness. We must understand the fact that from the time of Plato up to the present, philosophers have been discussing the notion of consciousness. In fact, all the writings of almost all philosophers in the West have been pointing to one center, that is consciousness. So, we can say there is a center in philosophy or a fixed point in philosophy, that is consciousness, and this is inevitable in philosophy. That is the reason why Richard Rorty very beautifully said that philosophers have been polishing the mirror of mind so that they can have a better vision of themselves, which means all the time philosophers are interested in discussing mind or consciousness. Now, what is wrong with that? We'll see. If you look at Indian philosophical and Western philosophical methods or discourse, one can say that there is a re-emergence of the problem. This means in the past at least 50 years, philosophers both East and West, they are rereading or reinterpreting the concept of consciousness. For example, in Indian tradition, one can say there is both a scientific as well as a philosophical approach. Thinkers like A.K. Mukhopadhyaya is a medical doctor in AIIMS, New Delhi, and there are scientists like V.V. Srikantan, Rajesh Kumar Kasturi Rangan, and B. Ramamurthy. B. Ramamurthy is a well-known neuroscientist, and philosophers like Balasubramanian and Bina Gupta. All these thinkers or philosophers or scholars, they have been discussing about the philosophy of mind or consciousness. So what I am trying to say is that it has attracted, that is the notion of consciousness or mind has attracted the attention of philosophers as well as scientists. Now, the phenomenologists give a new turn to the concept of consciousness. Now, let me say a few words about phenomenology. Those who are not familiar with this term, phenomenology, I would like to say some basic concepts in phenomenology. Phenomenology is a very important movement in the 20th century, started by Brentano and later Husserl, Heidegger, and the tradition goes like this. But we should know the fact that phenomenological method is very much available both in ancient as well as modern tradition. And also, this is one of the important movements of the 20th century, because the phenomenological method or the phenomenological movement has given a new way of understanding. In one way, we can say that it is a presuppositionless philosophy. Philosophers all the time, they are talking about presupposition. They start with some presupposition. Now, the phenomenologists try to understand philosophy as a presuppositionless one. But this can be questioned, no doubt, whether there can be any philosophy without any presuppositions. And in Indian tradition, though the word phenomenology is not used, there are some ancient systems like Advaita. It is a very important system in Indian philosophical discourse, which talks about the non-duality. So, traditions like Advaita made a substantial contribution to the field of phenomenology. That is, with a background of phenomenology, if we look at ancient Indian philosophical school like Advaita, we can see that how philosophers in India or philosophers in the East have discussed the notion of consciousness, which is somewhat similar to the Western phenomenological method. Now, often it is said conscious experience is subjective, right? It is private, it is unitary, and it is intentional. This is very important for the phenomenologists. It is intentional. So every conscious experience as a consequence of its intention. Without intention, there cannot be any consciousness. So there are three important components of experience. The first one is a brain confined consciousness, which means this is a embodied consciousness. This is otherwise known as embodied consciousness, which take into account the thoughts, feelings, and awareness. So this is brain confined consciousness. Then there is also what is called the brain independent consciousness. One can of course raise a question whether there can be any consciousness without a brain, or whether there can be consciousness without the role of a mind, brain. So it is said even before neurons come into biological existence, there is a consciousness. For example, the plant which has got consciousness come under this category of brain independent consciousness. And also there is a self-consciousness. This is very important in the context of phenomenology, that is, awareness of an experiencer, the self or self-consciousness. Now, this is an attempt to free consciousness from the brain, its awareness of the self. So, the self-consciousness is a awareness of one's own self. And in fact, we can say that there are three ways of understanding consciousness. One is irreducibility. That is, the argument goes like this, that it cannot be irreducible. Just as space and time are primitive dimensions in physics, conscious experience is a primitive concept. It is irreducible. This is one way of understanding consciousness. Then there is also another way, that is, I call it yam. Yam means magical, that is, consciousness sometimes is said to be supernatural and direct experience or expression of God's will. And the third is elimination, E, denying the existence of consciousness. There are no thoughts, and this view is pre-scientific. That is, this means what exists is the material brain and its neuron and chemicals. Apart from that, there is no special significance that is assigned to consciousness. Now, one of the important theory which is discussed by philosophers, especially in the West, is the mind-body identity theory, which has been playing a very important role. And this mind-body identity theory, which means is that which identifies the mental states and events with the physical process in the brain. In fact, this was developed in the year 1950s, and this was supported by thinkers like U.T. Place, J.G. Smart and others. Now, by saying that the mental properties are empirical properties, these thinkers were not claiming merely that mental process properties were properties of material bodies. So for them, every mental property is in reality a physical property, a property of the sort independently counterbalanced by the physical sciences. In short, identify mental process with the brain processes. I'll skip some of the slides. One thinker whom I would like to discuss in this context is Searle, a very important philosopher who belongs to this ordinary language philosophy school or Oxford language philosophy school, who actually, according to me, could synthesize successfully both the linguistic philosophy and the phenomenology. Because I always feel that there is a tension between analytic philosophy and phenomenology. But there are some thinkers who could synthesize both. And I always feel that this synthesis is very important. And Searle wrote a very important book, Rediscovery of Mind. And he has attempted a synthesis, and his method is something very novel, I would say. And what did he do? In this rediscovery of mind, Searle makes an attempt to evaluate all the existing theories of mind, starting from reductionism, because there are different theories like reductionism and functionalism and eliminativism, and develops a biological naturalism. This is a uniqueness of Searle, that is biological naturalism. Now, what does this mean? This biological naturalism is one in which he tries to present the theory of consciousness with a naturalistic theory of mind. This is Searle's unique contribution. So he tries to say that consciousness is an irreducible physical nature of the brain within a non-reductive type of naturalism. This is one way of understanding phenomenology. And the biological naturalism has got two important aspects. One is Searle argues that brain causes mind, and mind are higher level features of the brain. Now it is at this juncture he talks about the theory of intentionality, the theory of consciousness, a theory of unconsciousness, and a theory of mental causation. I'll skip some of the quotations given by him. He explains what consciousness is. This also I would like to skip. I'll come to another important methodology given by a great thinker by name Daniel Dennett. The phenomenological method explains the significance of consciousness in a philosophical way. Because there are other ways of understanding. For example, one can understand consciousness through the method which I suggested, that is magic also. This is one method which is in prevalence. So this phenomenological method tries to understand consciousness in a philosophical way. It is associated with others, that is consciousness, experience, feelings, sensations, qualia, subjective, introspection, reflection, etc. Now what I am going to say now is something very important, that is, there are two ways of understanding consciousness. One is the first person point of view, and second is the third person point of view. Now this is a very important aspect in the context of phenomenology. Whether one can understand phenomenology only in the context of the first person, or whether the third person also could be included here. That is the issue. Now Dennett, in his well-known book Consciousness Explained, argues in favor of the method of heterophenomenology. Now what is heterophenomenology? That is understanding phenomenology from the third person perspective. This is what he calls a heterophenomenology, which according to him is the right method of studying consciousness. Because normally we try to understand consciousness through the first person perspective, but here is a new method given by Daniel Dennett, that one can understand, or one should make an effort to understand consciousness through the third person perspective. So, heterophenomenology, what does it mean? It means it is a method of phenomenological description that can do justice to the most private and affable subjective experience. It has objectivity, neutrality and respect for the phenomenological subject. It is neutral since it is neither subjective nor objective. Thus, third person perspective is the best method of studying consciousness according to Daniel Dennett. Now, with this background, let us see how the phenomenologists like Husserl are talking about consciousness. In the entire phenomenological movement, the contribution of Husserl is something really remarkable, because he is the one who has talked about the intentionality of consciousness, and there is also a concept called conscious of. This is very important. This of OF is very important. So the of relation is something which is very significant in the phenomenological context. Now, what does this mean? This means that there is always of relation. That is, consciousness, according to Husserl, is always intentional. Which means, whenever we talk of consciousness, this of relation is involved. What does this mean? This means that objects that we perceive in this empirical world has this of relation. That means I am conscious of this object, which means the objects exist outside and I am conscious of it. And there is also what is called intention that is involved. That is the reason why the phenomenologists argue that the intentional aspect is very important in the context of consciousness. So in phenomenology, the world is the starting point of investigation of natural cognition, which means our understanding of the world starts with the cognition which we gain from the empirical world. So the world is the starting point. Then Husserl very rightly said that natural cognition begins with experience. This is very important. It is based on human experience and remains within experience. So, which is the starting point for phenomenology? Our own experience, our own relation with the empirical world, our own relation with the objects that are present to me. So, various experiences consist in the world. So, the collective horizon of a possible investigation is designated within the world. We start with this world. That is the reason why I said in the beginning, it is a presuppositionless philosophy. The world is the original source of perception and intuition. This one can understand through perceptual process. In perception, for example, consciousness is one of the essential factors of perception. If I am not conscious of the object, then I cannot have the perceptual knowledge. So, it is the most important factor owing to its essence and function. And in fact, Husserl indicates that the essence of consciousness is a intentionality. This is very important. And he says, I quote him, the essence of consciousness in which I live as my own self is the so-called intentionality. As the essence of consciousness, the intentionality leads to consciousness to connect the object, and the object is perceived by consciousness eventually, which means unless this of relation is there, unless or if the notion of relation is absent, then the knowledge of the external world cannot be communicated. Unless there is a of relation, one cannot understand the role of perception. In fact, he in his book very beautifully talks about the three important concepts. That is, the title of the book is The Logical Investigation. And he tries to examine consciousness in three ways. He says consciousness as the entire or real phenomenological being of the empirical ego as the interweaving of a psychic experience in the unified stream of consciousness. Now, consciousness as the inner awareness of one's own psychic experience and consciousness as a comprehensive designation of a mental act or intentional experience of all sorts. So all experience, in short, according to Husserl, are included in consciousness. If consciousness is absent, then the experience of particular object is absent. Now, this is a very brief background of phenomenology. I have not entered into the technicalities because my aim is to see whether there could be a parallel in Eastern thought. So the basic idea I have presented. Now let me see how we can understand Indian philosophical tradition with a phenomenological background. Because the phenomenological movement is very popular. And I would like to say, or I would wish that the phenomenological movement should be the guiding factor for philosophers, at least for another 100 years, because that's a beautiful movement, a very important movement which has emerged in the 20th century, and it has been playing a very important role. So, I would like to see whether there are any parallels between the Western phenomenological method and Indian philosophical tradition. Now, one of the important, because in India, Indian philosophical discourse, we have been talking about the notion of consciousness in detail. So, what type of consciousness they are talking about? This is my botheration. So, with the distinction between, now one of the important point which I would like to place before you for consideration is that in Indian tradition we make a distinction between functional consciousness and foundational consciousness, which is absent, I would say, in Western phenomenology. Functional consciousness and foundational consciousness. What does this mean? A functional consciousness is a consciousness which is helpful in understanding the objects and things of the world. Let us say the empirical world. The world which is in front of me, or the world in which I participate and perform all my action, has this functional consciousness. I am able to recognize you. I am able to see objects and things because the consciousness is functioning in me. So I am aware of you. So this is what they call functional consciousness. That's fine. But that is, apart from this functional consciousness, Indian philosophers also talk about foundational consciousness. The foundational consciousness is something very basic. And they argue, without this foundational consciousness, you cannot understand the world, not only the world, but everything, which means the transcendental understanding of the Supreme Brahman, for example, is possible only through the foundational consciousness. So, since objects are unthinkable apart from consciousness, what is the role of a foundational consciousness? Are we taking an ontological leap? This is my question. Now let me explain this a little further. So I would like to tell you that one of the important, as I said in the beginning, one of the important philosophical tradition in India is a system called Advaita Vedanta. Advaita philosophy teaches a non-dualism, And it is a system which believes that there is an identity between the individual self and the supreme self. The individual self is that is me, or otherwise it is known as Atman, which is identical to Brahman. Now, I would like to state that in this discourse, especially in Advaitic discourse, we see how they could transcend the phenomenology which has been established by Husserl and others. Let me go to a text. This is a text which I am going to quote, two texts. One important text is the Mandukya Upanishad. It is a Upanishad. Upanishad means, those who are not familiar with the term, I would like to state, it is a text which, in fact, the word Upanishad means sitting near the teacher and receiving instruction about the ultimate reality. So there are 108 Upanishads, and there are 13 Upanishads which are very important, and one of the important Upanishad is the Mandukya Upanishad. Now this is where I would like to apply the Western phenomenology. How? The Mandukya Upanishad says that there are three states of experience. What is that? Waking stage, dream, and deep sleep stage. There are three states of experience. In the waking stage, we see some objects or things. That's one thing. So, I am able to see a particular object, for example. So, all knowledge is possible in the empirical world through my waking stage. For example, I am able to recognize this object, or I am able to identify my friend through this waking experience. Then the second stage is dream stage, wherein the consciousness is operative. How? After waking from your dream stage, for example, you are able to say, oh, I saw a line in my dream. Right? After waking from your dream stage, for example, you may make a statement, oh, in my dream, I saw a line in my dream. So when I use the word I saw a line, this means consciousness is operating. So waking stage, consciousness is operating. Then the dream stage also there is consciousness which is operative. Then there is also the third stage which is known as a deep sleep stage. What is a deep sleep stage? A person sleeps very nicely. After presentation in this seminar, for example, one can say, oh, I was tired. I made a presentation, but I was so tired, there are so many questions, I have to answer all the questions. So after that, I slept nicely. I don't know what happened, I slept nicely. Are we not making this statement? Oh, I slept nicely. So when you make the statement that I slept nicely, I don't know what happened, this means that consciousness is operating. I would request you to see my argument. My argument is very simple, but at the same time it is little complicated. In the sense that in our empirical experience, right, there are three stages of experience. One is in waking stage, second is in a dream stage, and third is a deep sleep stage. So all the three stages are connected to the empirical world, the world. My point is that in all the three stages, consciousness is operative. You may ask the question, how do you say that consciousness is operative in the second stage, namely dream stage? The answer is very simple. After your dream, when you become normal, in the sense that when you become the next stage, then waking, you are able to make the statement that I saw a line in my dream. So consciousness is operative, that's why you are able to make the statement. Similarly, in deep sleep stage also you are making the statement. So all the three states of experience are connected to consciousness. Without consciousness, it is not possible to understand these three states of experience. Now my humble point is that here we can say that the Western phenomenology is very much similar to that. In fact, Husserl, whom I was discussing just now, is the one who is talking about the empirical world. He always talks of this intentionality of consciousness. So all these are fine. The empirical life has this phenomenology of experience which Husserl speaks of. Absolutely no quarrel with the phenomenologists of the West. But the beauty of Indian philosophical system is that we go beyond that. Besides these three states of experience, we take the fourth stage, or we take a different stage which is known as Turiya in Sanskrit. This stage is a conscious stage, but that consciousness is pure in nature. They say this conscious stage is pure in the sense there is no object to be perceived. There is nothing to experience. It is a state of pure consciousness. It is a foundational consciousness which the Advaitins talk about. Hope I made the distinction clear. One is at the empirical sphere of life, consciousness is operative, but they go beyond that and talk about a stage which is known as Turiya, where consciousness is not fragmented, it is one consciousness, O capital, and it is identical to the Supreme Brahman. Now this, according to many Indian philosophers, is the transcendental phenomenology. Phenomenology which we have been using in the Western context is limited to the empirical sphere of life. But Indian philosophy could go further and argue that there can be consciousness without any object. If you ask me what is the nature of consciousness, I can only say that consciousness is pure in nature. It is unitary consciousness. It is not fragmentary like the empirical consciousness. It is one and it is identical with the Supreme. So in that stage, there is no experience, there is no object to be experienced. It is something pure, that's all. It is something abstract, if you want, you can say it is abstract. So in this way, one can say that Indian way of examining phenomenology has some nuances. What is that? That they transcend the method which is employed in the West, and they could successfully show that it need not be the case that all the time there should be some object in order to have consciousness. There can be consciousness without any experience of the object. That's why in the beginning I said in Indian philosophical discourse, especially in the philosophy of Advaita, we make a distinction between functional and foundational. This functional consciousness is something which is directly related to our empirical sphere of life. This functional. It is functional in the sense it is operative all the time because of consciousness, because here objects are intended. Without object we cannot understand, as I said in the beginning, that the knowledge gains because of the synthesis that exists between the knower and the known. But apart from this functional consciousness, there is something foundational. And this foundational consciousness is something pure, something abstract, something which cannot be communicated by words also. So if you ask me what is the nature of the individual, nobody can say that. It is something in which you identify yourself with the Supreme Being. So in this way, I would say that one can draw certain parallel between Indian phenomenology and Western phenomenology, and one can also say that Indian philosophical discourse has dealt the phenomenology in a detailed way, and they could transcend the phenomenology of Husserl. But I have one problem. Don't think that I simply accept what the Indian philosophers say. It's fine. What the Advaita, the philosophy prescribes is something remarkable, no doubt. But my humble question is that, in fact, in many platform and seminars, I used to question the Advaitic tradition. They say, I would like to say that you are taking what we call the ontological leap. This is what I mentioned in my previous slide. Ontological leap, which means from the empirical world, you talk about the transcendental world, but you are using the same category. So is it not a problem? The ontological leap, will it solve the problem? So this is my major question, and I have raised this question in many philosophical platforms, but the answer that is given is quite interesting. They say, no, we cannot define the nature of it. So in this way, I would like to state that there is a difference between Western phenomenology and Indian phenomenology, and I would like to say 3 points as a concluding remark. One is, there is always a parallel. I am always interested to show some parallels between Indian philosophy and Western philosophical thoughts. And the so-called new movements which have emerged in the West could see some parallels in Indian philosophical tradition also. And the Western phenomenology has its limitation by saying that it has got the empirical world which is to be experienced all the time. The Indian phenomenologists could show that we can also transcend this. So these are my 3 concluding remarks. With this, I would like to stop, and if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. First, I'll actually give a chance to our friends on Skype who have followed from the beginning, since would anyone on Skype like to speak? Andrew, you have some questions?
Yes. Hello. Thank you very much, Professor. That was a wonderful discussion, and the issues that were raised are fun. They're very enjoyable. I hope I can. I'll tell you what. I wrote some stuff down. Let me work through this and see where it goes. Is brain-independent consciousness represented through persistent quantum fields or lattices? Or alternatively, could we see that through higher dimensional structural memory, like, for example, in stem cells? And in that case, do we then find a possible solution to the hard consciousness problem? Or at least a control to that view? And I have all the questions are fairly heady, so I don't know how we should engage in this discourse.
Go ahead. Go ahead and ask your questions, Andrew.
Oh, okay. The ontological leap that you mentioned in your slides, is that a response to recent work in Western non-duality? For example, Hunt made the claim that we can say accurately that reality is epistemologically dual, but ontologically non-dual. Is that an overreach, do you think? I've been reading that work recently, and I've been contemplating that same triadic solution to non-duality through ontology.
Okay. Maybe you answer that question first. Okay.
Yeah, I'll take your second question first. Now, see, the ontological leap, of course, as you know, every philosophical system has a particular ontology. Without ontology, it is very difficult for a philosopher to construct his own system, his methodology. So, ontology is very much needed. But the problem is when you are using the ontology for one purpose, that is for the empirical way of understanding, then if you use the same category, if you transcend it and then you apply the same category of the framework, then the problem comes. This is my botheration. Of course, one can say the ontological leap could be avoided by saying both the empirical and the transcendental are one and the same, or this is a part of the empirical is part of the transcendental. This is what I question. So it is not possible for us to take the ontological leap. Somewhere where you are using, my argument is very simple. You are using the categories which are available to you in order to understand the empirical world. Okay. Then what you do is you use the same categories to talk about something which is transcendental. So what I mean to say is that your language is limited. You are using a particular language in order to understand all empirical this thing. So don't talk about that. Leave it. Then you don't claim that this ontology could be understood in this way. This is this thing. Then secondly, this brain independent consciousness. Yes, actually, this is one of the three consciousness, three kinds of consciousness which I was talking about was given by a medical doctor by name Mukhopadhyaya, and he says there could be that brain independent consciousness, and I was giving the plants for example. He says it is different from it has no brain, but the consciousness is there. So this could be used as a model to understand that all the time brain is not needed to understand consciousness. This is what I would like to say. I don't know whether you are convinced with my reply.
Oh, thank you. No, I'm convinced. I mean, non-dually, it is very challenging to convey much of anything convincingly. So I will say that I understand and I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. We have limited time, so can I ask anyone, Manuel, do you have a question you wrote down? Does somebody else have a question I'd like to share before we come back to Andrew?
Do you have a microphone?
Atsushi has a question here.
Yes, thank you for very interesting, comprehensive explanation of consciousness. As a physician,
Okay.
I have a very simple question. So you talk about two kinds of consciousness, functional and fundamental. And I'm curious about the consciousness of deep coma patient, brainless patient.
Okay.
So, what's your opinion about that?
I don't know how a philosopher can answer this question, but let me narrate this from our experience. Some 20 years back, we organized a philosophy department, right? Organized a seminar on consciousness. And of course, philosophers spoke very nicely on various aspects of consciousness. But for the valedictory, we have invited one neurologist by name B. Ramamurthy, a well-known neurologist. It's surprising, he came and said, he said, what philosophers you talk about consciousness, it has nothing relevant to us, is what he says. We are all shocked. But he says, no, it is not like that. No, you have to understand consciousness from a different perspective. So, the perspective differs, but I would like to say that, for example, a person who is in coma can never, this is, a philosophical perspective, totally wrong. This is, he cannot have any consciousness. He is, I don't know, I can't answer you. Okay. Because we are in two different levels. As a philosopher, I can theorize everything, but you are very, practical and this thing, you have got some answer. I don't know. Yeah.
Like in psychology,
Yeah.
there is a discussion of self actually.
Yeah.
And what they say, it's very interesting. Actually, this is what I want to ask you. They say in the West, they thought that there is a unique self, but when you study the brain, you realize our perception of self is actually done in one center which receives a lot of information from multiple at the same time continuing processes.
Yeah.
And this book explains that this was a very astonishing finding, and especially for the West. But in the East, it was understandable because already in the East they had realized that self is not so unique and is not one. And actually, my thought was that Eastern philosophies accept that self is fragmented, but Indian philosophy apparently doesn't think so. So, what's the situation? Do you know of Eastern philosophies that think of self as fragmented or?
Now, if you ask me my view on how Indian philosophers approach, I would say that self, according to them, is one. It is not fragmented. Especially this is from the Advaitic standpoint, a particular school of thought. Now they say the self is one, which means all of us are united. That is what is called unity of consciousness. I share my consciousness with you, which means there is no difference between you and me. So they don't consider human body as the important one. They consider the self, which is a one and which is not fragmentary in nature. So this self, or which is otherwise known as universal self, is identical to what they call Brahman. Brahman is not God, of course. A concept, a philosophical concept which they use, and they say that they are identical. That's why they say, I am Brahma. That is a Sanskrit term, which means I am identical to the Supreme. I am non-different from the Supreme. So in this way, they say that self is one. Of course, for all our practical purposes, we make a distinction between you and me, between me and others. So that is possible, that is necessary in order to perform all our activities. But ultimately speaking, or the fundamental concept that is important here is that selves are one and there is no what we call the fragment. That's why we don't talk about the fragmentary consciousness. This is operative only in the empirical.
Buddhism is the same?
Buddhism also talks about this understanding. But very beautifully, now Indian philosophical discourse, apart from Buddhism, is that they say that mind and spirit, they make a distinction mind and spirit, and they say that mind is superior than body, mind and body. Mind and body, they say mind is more important, but Buddhism, both are given equal importance. So in fact, I have a paper on Buddhist phenomenology, and I have shown that how Buddhist phenomenology is different from other Indian philosophical discourse on phenomenology. Thank you. Yeah.
That's not my question.
Okay.
No. There are different takes in Western philosophers about phenomenology. From the history of phenomenology, that was started from Dantaru, already told about these things, and then Husserl, and Merleau-Ponty. Okay, before that, we have got phenomenological philosophy from Heidegger. Actually, I've been reading Heidegger?
After Husserl.
After Husserl, yes. So I'm beginner.
No.
So my first question is here, how can we understand the phenomenology of Heidegger and phenomenology of Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology of Husserl? Okay, this is the first question. Another question is related to Indian thought. As a know about Shankara from you, Shankara Vedanta philosophy, sometimes it is argued by philosopher or commentator that Shankara's philosophy is very much, maybe I'm not sure, phenomenological. But how can we make a link the Shankara's philosophy or Shankara's phenomenological philosophy with the philosophy of Merleau-Ponty or Husserl? These are my questions to make sense.
Now for your first question I cannot answer because I need 1 hour. Because you want to show the distinction between Husserl's phenomenology, then Heidegger's phenomenology, and then Merleau-Ponty. It's very difficult because there were 3 different methods, but the basic core idea is that phenomenology and consciousness is always intended. Okay? Intentionality of consciousness, that remains the same. For example, Merleau-Ponty talks about the body as something very important. That about Shankara, for example. Now, at least I don't know about in other countries, at least in India, we are making some effort to see some parallels which we can draw from Western tradition and try to see our philosophy, whether that will fit in. Not that we are going to finally say, oh, everything which is said by Husserl or somebody is already available in Indian tradition. No, that is not our argument. Our argument is to show that these modern movements which are available in the West, they have got some elementary principles in Indian system also. By that, what is the benefit? You might ask, what is the benefit? The benefit is that we want to show that Indian philosophy is not dead. It is active. In the sense, otherwise, no, there are students, for example, in our universities and colleges, they question, what is the purpose of me studying the concept like moksha or liberation or karma? So we want to show that these modern movements are, at least to some extent, is available in our Indian tradition too. In one way, we are not apologetic, please note that. We want to say that these movements have some aspects which is similar to our Indian thought. For example, when analytic philosophy or linguistic philosophy became a very important movement due to Wittgenstein and others, there was a tremendous change in the methodology of philosophers throughout the globe. But if you observe very closely Indian philosophy, then you say we have some sort of, I am using the word sort of, some sort of analytical elements which is prevalent in ancient philosophical system. That's all. There we stop. We don't say no, here both are equal, no, never. But let us see Indian philosophy or try to interpret Indian philosophy in a new way so that we can improve ourselves, one. And secondly, these elements which are available in the West is also could be seen in the light of the modern trends. That is our aim, and I follow that.
Thank you. I have another question here from Spain. Manuel asks, how phenomenology explains the different epistemological values?
Yeah, the epistemological values which are emphasized in the empirical world it will go in accordance with phenomenology. Absolutely, there is no problem with regard to, because now phenomenology as a method of understanding the world includes, or it talks about all the values which we are talking about. So phenomenology would endorse all the epistemological values, and there is no problem at all with this epistemologists or the phenomenological understanding. Absolutely, I would say both converge at a particular point.
Okay, thank you very much. I think, Chidadip, you have a question? Yes?
When you just said to him about the mind and body inclusion, it's equal. No, the mind is supposed to be over the body.
Yeah, that's right. But what I was trying to say is, in Advaita, for example, mind and body, when we make the distinction between mind and body, we say mind is more important than body. Okay. Now, in this Buddhist this disparity does not arise. This disparity in the sense keeping mind or consciousness as something supreme. Now, for example, the Buddhists, they talk about various types of consciousness. You understand? The visual consciousness they were talking about, then the touch consciousness they are talking about. So the consciousness there, according to them, is of various types, which is not acceptable to a system like Advaita. That's what I was trying to say. This disparity between mind and spirit, mind and body, is something which is peculiar to Advaita system, which of course the Buddhists would completely deny that. That's what I was trying to say. So there are different types of consciousness which a Buddhist speaks of, which is not taken into account by a system like Advaita. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think it's been an excellent introduction to phenomenology. We need to stop for today and resume at another occasion. Thank you very much, Professor Panneerselvam.